this is the reality. You know, children are being taught relationships and sex education in schools now where it's legally mandatory for them to learn about LGBT families. There are people who are cross-dressing on the streets. There's men holding each other's hands, walking around the streets, right? During gay pride, during LGBT history, our children are encouraged to wear rainbow clothing, rainbow ties, rainbow socks, rainbow shoelaces, to wear a rainbow badge, you know, things like that, right? And this by no means is me being homophobic. This is me saying to my community, these are the dangers. We can sit at home as elders, as grandparents, as parents, and so on and so forth, and think we're not affected by this. This is being taught in school. This is a school assembly. It's a school assembly. Where were all of these transgender people before? You understand? So there are these questions that nobody wants to ask. Nobody wants to ask this question because it is too controversial. The LGBT lobby will come down, right, like a ton of bricks against people. They'll be all plastered all over the media. Don't be surprised if you see me all over the media because I'm talking about this stuff in public. Do you understand? And our issue in all of this is, you know what, the narrative, the LGBT narrative, forget convincing. It sounds forced. It comes across as forced, and people are not, we're not being asked to accept the LGBT community. You know what, I'm happy. According to the law of the land, you have the freedom to be who you want. I don't have a problem with that. But we've got to a point where this stuff is being forced down the throats of our children. And this is a psychological issue. You don't find out if a particular sexual attraction is natural or not based on, I mean, yeah, people are like, oh, there's a gene, there's a gay gene. This doesn't exist. There is no gay gene. So ultimately, the only way to really establish this stuff is a combination of, it's basically, you have to use induction. It's based on, if so many people, it's in the animal kingdom, you know, and there's X% of people are also gay, so it must be natural, otherwise why else are they gay? Does that make sense? But then that's like saying, okay, the adultery is natural, you know, pedophilia is natural, because it exists. Things aren't natural and normal just because they exist, all right? But the message is clear. Allah is telling us, yes, this exists, but guess what? I don't approve. And if you do it, this is what's gonna happen. Adults and young people alike need to study these things if we want to deal with the kind of woke onslaught, this crazy kind of normalization of LGBT and it being forced down our children's throats so that our children are forced to agree and accept and validate and so on and so forth, things that are basically kufr, right? How do we protect our children from that if their natural inclination often is to feel connected to the left? And personally, this is what I do. I run a mentoring program called the Youth Mentoring Program for 14 to 18-year-olds, and I basically teach this stuff to them. All right, it's a couple of hours a week. It doesn't clash with their GCSEs. It doesn't clash with their busy schedules, and we cover this stuff. I have a couple of youth programs like that. And for adults, I run a course called How to Protect Our Iman in Today's Climate that covers these things. And basically, I run them online off of my website called Mawarid Lifestyle. So even now that I'm an imam in Chelmsford, one of the things that I bring kind of to the masjid as an imam is these kind of things. So I'm trying to incorporate these things into the madrasa curriculum as well as try to impart them to the adults and so on.
What is the advice for brothers and sisters that can't get married or don't want to marry because they have homosexual urges? If you ask this question as a Muslim, what is the answer? You don't need to ask me, right? I should only have to explain this question to a non-Muslim. That's the first point. The second point, therefore, is that if you are a Muslim and you have these urges, then you don't need a fiqhi answer. What you need is counseling. It's only because it's now in the media and we're talking about it all getting legalized, etc., that a Muslim who kind of has been exposed to this stuff starts to feel like he or she is missing out. You know, somebody has homosexual urges and maybe has even acted according to it, but understands that it's a sin, but has iman, is still better than somebody who's having homosexual urges because their faith is wavering. right? That person is on the door on the door of kufr, and this person is on the door of fisk. The two things are very, very different.
Homosexuality, you might think, oh my God, how is this okay and how is society accepting it? Well, that's connected to the idea of individual liberty and the idea of individualism. It's because of those philosophies that European society sees nothing wrong with that. And it's not like, oh, you know, they've always been like this, that in Europe homosexuality has always been accepted. No. It was a gradual journey. They realized that we think differently now. According to the way we think now, there's nothing wrong with this. And so gradually it gains acceptance. People who engage in it are tolerated. Eventually, these people campaigns for it to become legal. It becomes legal. Then the homosexual marriages are, gay marriages are recognized, etc., etc. Now it's got to a stage where it is promoted to the extent that it is, our children are taught in school that this is okay and we have to tolerate it. And if they're unlucky enough to end up with a particularly liberal-minded teacher, then that teacher will go beyond the mandate of the government. The government just wants our children to know that there's different types of families. And some families have two fathers and some families have two mothers, right? That's all the government wants. But if the teacher is liberal-minded, the teacher is going to go a little bit further and try to promote it in the minds of the children. Does that make sense? Where does that come from? Why am I saying the liberal-minded teacher? Why is she doing that? She's doing that because she is liberal-minded. Meaning she subscribes to a certain philosophy, a set of ideas. Right? Generally, Muslims are completely asleep to this stuff. We think, oh, that teacher, she did this because she's a kafir, she's a khabith, she's that, she's this. But behind it is a sophisticated set of ideas that are still anti-Islamic. Islam has a problem with them. Right? But because we've been so blind to them, we've not engaged those ideas and tried to tackle them. Or as a minimum, at least educated our children to the dangers of those ideas. We haven't done that. Now the next danger. The next danger is that our children gradually from childhood through primary school to secondary school, and then in particular towards the end of secondary school through sixth form and then at university, start to value these ideas. If people are measuring it against their common sense and they're taking all of the facts on board and then thinking, okay, what is right, what is wrong, then that's okay. But that's not what your young 18, 19-year-old Muslim at university is doing. He isn't measuring it against some sort of objective standard, right? He's not thinking, okay, let's think of this purely from the point of view of common sense. Let's take all of the facts on board. No. He's measuring it against a standard that has already influenced him, that belongs to a complex ideology that is 300-400 years old. He's measuring it against secular principles, against liberal principles. He's measuring it against the Western concept of equality. Not equality objectively speaking, the idea of equality objectively, but the Western conception of equality. I'm sorry if this is too complicated for some of you, but I have to explain this to people because otherwise we're in serious trouble. Right? So now what's happening is he's saying, okay, if Islam doesn't measure up to these things, then Islam can't be right. If Islam doesn't measure up to these things, Islam can't be right. That is your average Muslim youngster, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put the light of hidayah inside his heart so firmly that when he hears of these things, he says, astaghfirullah, and he just basically rejects it. Is this how we want our children to grow up and live? To have these ideas and these ideologies? Well, actually, do you know what? Whatever your answer is in your head, if you think no, I'm sorry, my friends, you don't have a choice. That's exactly how your children are being brought up. That is exactly how they're being brought up. Through school, through college, through university, and then through life. Right? And most of us won't even know that our children live by these ideals. It just so happens that some of them choose to remain true to their Islamic identity and others do not. The solution to this is a proper Islamic education. With young people, we do preventative work. So the courses I do for young people targeting 14 to 18-year-olds, I consider it to be prevention. These are children that, you know, they're doing well in school and so on, but they don't know. They need to be educated so that they can resist So I call it, that's just called building resilience, right? So that their defenses are adequate against those concepts as they go through college and as they go through university.